Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs speaks. I had never realized what grand things air and sunlight are till I had been deprived of them. Harriet Jacobs. Now, pay close attention, grandsons and daughters, because I want to talk to you about a great icon of history and a constant subject of my studies, Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs. Born into slavery in North Carolina, the illustrious Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs was just a little under 10 years older than Queen Mother Harriet Tubman, her namesake. Yet, unlike Tubman, Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs actually enjoyed the early part of her childhood, at least up to the age of 9. In fact, when her mother was alive, she had a pleasant childhood. From an enslaved person's perspective, this was not typical. After the passing of her mother, she lived with her mistress, who taught her how to write, read, and sew. After her mistress's demise, however, she was forced to live under Dr. James Norcrum, the father of the young child who now owned her under law. This unfortunate fate proved to be detrimental to both her body and mind. Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs knew the way to freedom was to escape to the free states of the North. By this time, she had 2 children who were sent to her grandmother because she was unable to care for them. After planning her escape, several experiences forced her to endure the 4 elements to survive as she anxiously awaited to acquire the help of people who could sketch the path for her freedom. Sarah Bradford shed light on the experiences that Queen Mother Harriet Tubman went through while self-emancipating. Her experiences were different from those of Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs. Yet, we can glean information from both about the challenges enslaved people encountered with the elements on their journey to freedom. Let's look at a few instances that potentially transpired into examples of transphysics and the higher application of the 4 elements in a time of need. I suffered much more during the second winter than I did during the first. My limbs were benumbed by inaction, and cold filled them with cramp. I have a very painful sensation of coldness in my head. Even my face and tongue stiffened, and I lost the power of speech. He returned with herbs, roots, and ointment. He was especially charged to rub on the ointment by a fire. In her autobiography, Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs wrote about her escape from supposed owners. She describes a series of instances where she had to hide in the bushes, under floorboards, and even on a ship because they were trying to track her down. Through these words, she tells us how she had to contend with the winter to survive. Her freedom came for her at the cost of mental and physical suffering. You can begin to understand her feelings through the words she uses, such as cramp, benumbed, and stiffened. She lost the ability to move and her power of speech, trying to escape. At the same time, we see how a certain individual, her brother, helped her with herbs, roots, and ointments. The use of fire in this statement further indicates how the ancestors strategically employed the elements to create harmony where there was imbalance. Here, fire was utilized to battle the cold on Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs' behalf. This is especially insightful when referring back to the statement made by the Honorable Frederick Douglass, especially when we use it to draw a parallel between collective freedom and personal freedom. The journey for freedom continued for the self-emancipated even after escaping from the plantation. Keep this in mind when studying our Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs' life. It revealed that even after obtaining freedom and withstanding the perilous nature of the journey, she never fully enjoyed the peace that one expects to accompany the liberated. Not when the laws and people were put in place to thrust her and anyone vulnerable, whether enslaved or free, back into the clutches of bondage. It was incredible what our enslaved ancestors had to be willing to endure for their freedom. Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs endured the following trials for 7 years. I asked myself, how many more summers and winters I must be condemned to spend thus? I longed to draw in a plentiful draught of fresh air, to stretch my cramped limbs, to have room to stand erect, to feel the earth under my feet again. When Queen Mother Jacobs says condemned, let it indicate for you the great depth of her suffering. She remained steadfast throughout this period of isolation, surviving only on the hopes of a future that didn't require her to serve a life in bondage to anyone. In this process, we witness her transition from a person in total despair, desperately longing for a fresh breath of air and earth beneath her feet, to a woman determined to endure all obstacles in order to realize her future filled with hope. This kind of hope expressed by Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs can help us cling to the idea that things will get better for those of us who endure through periods of suffering. The three elements, air, fire, and earth, highlighted in this instance, become a form of inspiration because physically, that is what she looks forward to the most. It is almost like she dreams of rejuvenating her body, mind, and soul with fresh air and the earthy soil so that she can be her own person rather than live oppressed. In summer, the most terrible thunderstorms were acceptable, for the rain came through the roof and I rolled up my bed so that it might cool the hot boards under it. Later in the season, storms sometimes wet my clothes through and through, and that was not comfortable when the air grew chilly with oakum. This instance is another example of how self-emancipation required our ancestors to contend with the raw forces of nature. Here, Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs highlighted how thunderstorms were acceptable to her because her bed was extremely hot. The cool rain from the roof cooled the boards under the bed, making her hiding conditions more livable. At the same time, the thunderstorms also wet her clothes and caused her extreme discomfort in the cold. Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs also stated that the rainwater would make things worse as the air grew chilly even with the oakum. Oakum was used as a sealant in ships back in those days to stop air or anything else from entering the cracks. Through this occurrence, she highlighted how the chilly air was able to make her uncomfortable despite the oakum around her. The next incident from Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs' life takes us back to chapter 2 of this book, where we discussed the integral role that our matriarchs played in developing processes to heal and fend off infectious diseases. Much like the narrations about my grandmother Betty and great-grandmother Lena May, this incident also sheds light on how a good grandmother helped Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs get rid of the pain caused by insect bites with herbal teas and cooking medicines. But for weeks, I was tormented by hundreds of little red insects, fine as needles points that pierced through my skin and produced an intolerable burning. The good grandmother gave me herb teas and cooking medicines, and finally, I got rid of them. As we walk through different events that transpire throughout history, the role of divine health and divine self-care via use of the 4 elements becomes more and more undeniable. Our ancestors knew something about transphysics, something not everyone was aware of, as Dr. Martin Luther King highlighted earlier. It was this particular knowledge that got them through the hardest phases of life. One cannot imagine the excruciating pain of several insect stings, and had it not been for the healing powers found in nature, there wouldn't have been much to end the suffering. But prior to the insect bites, Queen Mother Harriet Jacobs had an even more frightening and painful encounter with nature that could have been deadly for her. In the following account, she explains how a serious injury resulted from her efforts to self-emancipate in the suddenness of night. Suddenly, a reptile of some kind seized my leg. In my fright, I struck a blow which loosened its hold, but I could not tell whether I had killed it. It was so dark I could not see what it was. I only knew it was something cold and slimy. The pain I felt soon indicated that the bite was poisonous. I was compelled to leave my place of concealment, and I groped my way back into the house. The pain had become intense, and my friend was startled by my look of anguish. I asked her to prepare